So we are going to talk about spent fuel and also in particular about collaborative siting of said fuel. When you look at what the U.S. Department of Energy has done with the call for proposals and awarding of 12 consortia funding, what we've been doing is crisscrossing the United States using all sorts of platforms to engage with various community members and to talk about spent fuel. And what we've learned so far is that we've got a larger discussion around nuclear energy, and that's where it kind of fits in accordingly. So what we're going to do today is, and then there's an agenda for today, but I wanted to start off by just kind of showing this particular map, right? And on this particular map, we've got kind of showing you the 70 plus US reactor sites, and then also that we've got about 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel and where it's located, generally speaking. So what we're, again, about is about collaboration-based siting, looking at the future, the shorter, long term, and then the longer term, what we're going to do with our spent fuel. We are not here, or actually we're going to start with what we're here to do, right? We are definitely here to share information and engage in dialogue with you around spent fuel, and more broadly, because we know it's going to come up, right? We're going to talk about nuclear energy and the industry as a whole. To also give some personal stories coming from Mothers for Nuclear as well as Native Nuclear, and then to collect your feedback, right? So your questions and your comments, so that then we can share this, just as the other consortia are doing with the Department of Energy. So we're not here to bring spent fuel or nuclear waste to your communities. We're not here to make you pro-nuclear. And then also we're not here to build new nuclear reactors in this particular state, right? We're really about fact-finding and sharing and having a discussion around the industry as well, around nuclear energy, and then also, in particular, spent fuel. Your feedback matters, and we want to get it from the very beginning, right? And to be able then to engage in that discussion, have your questions, have your comments be made, and then for us to distill that and share that. And just imagine, we've got these 12 consortia that have been crisscrossing the United States, engaging in this particular format. So we will have a rich amount of information to share with the Department of Energy. First and foremost, and I know some of you have gotten some of that information as some of our students have been walking around. But we are going to have a number of surveys that we will be doing at certain points during our presentation and the discussion that we're going to have. And the first one is right now. So if I could have you, if you go to your emails, there would have been a message sent out. And the server that we're using is STN Guest, so that then you can sign on if you're not using your own personal plan. So if I can ask you to do our first survey, please. Pardon me? Let us know if there's any issue. We've got a few of our students here that can come to your particular table. So in the subject, yeah, so you might have to refresh. In the subject line, it will say, first survey. Okay. So the server we're using is STN-guest. There are 5 or 6 of them that show up when you go to connect. Just also let us know if we need to come to your table. Yeah. So if you have a particular plan, I always find that, even though sometimes it's fewer bars. All right, so I'm going to move it back just to say, well, what's the format for today, right? So we're going to do some introductions as well, and I want to know who's in the audience as well, since we're going to be engaging in conversation for a good part of the morning, right? And then we're going to introduce a bit more about collaboration-based siting for interim storage. You're going to hear from two of the organizations that make up our consortium, and consortium in particular, and you're going to have an opportunity to question and answers and comments accordingly after each one of their presentations. And there's a survey in there as well, and then we're going to have a break. You don't have to wait until the right time to get up. I had the fruit this morning. It was absolutely delicious, right? So there is fruits and pastries, etc. Water as well, and there is a hot bar as well for coffee, as well as tea. So please feel free to get up as we're going along and help yourselves. So after the first break, then North Carolina State will have a presentation, and then there's an opportunity to ask questions again, and then we're going to have lunch in here as well, and then go into breakout sessions. So some of the additional questions that you may have or comments that you'd like to share with us, we can do that at that point. And then there's going to be a closeout. Right? So that's how our day looks today, and I'm so happy that you decided to spend your Saturday with us. I know that you could be anywhere doing a number of other things on the weekend, and to share part of your Saturday with us, we are very grateful. And it also shows that this is an important topic that we need to kind of gather together and chat about. I want to introduce the team at this particular point. So I see one or two kind of moving up here. So the first up is Scott. Do you want to say something or just introduce?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Lathrop. I'm from San Luis Obispo, California area, part of the local Native tribe. And later on this morning, we will be kind of sharing a tribal story as it relates to nuclear power in our community. So, great to have you all here.
Wonderful. And then there's Dr. Robert Hayes. Oh, he just wants to wave right now. You'll hear from him shortly. And Heather was in here a minute ago. Heather Hoff. She is one of the co-founders for Mothers for Nuclear, and you'll hear a little bit more from her profile before she shares her personal story within the field. And then Farish Day is right here in the fuchsia that I love on the side. And she's not coming up, so I guess she'll introduce herself a little bit more later on. So I want to hear a little bit about who are you? And why did you decide to come and spend some time with us? So how many of you are from within the nuclear industry, past or present? All right, wonderful. And others how did you find out about this particular gathering? What was that?
I'm a doctoral student at UMLB.
A doctoral student at UMLB?
On the policy side, so I want to learn more about like the engineering side.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here. So a doctoral student at UNLV, and on the policy side, I wanted to know a little bit more on the technical side. Yes?
I heard about it from friends that's DOE and this site, and then I posted it on the public, on the open site on Facebook.
Wonderful.
So anybody will.
Excellent. So word of mouth from a DOE person and then posted it on Facebook. Wonderful. Anyone else? Yes?
I work for the Governor's Agency for Nuclear Projects in Nevada, but I heard about it out of chaplain with the police and fire department, and one of my firefighters said that we had
Lovely. Thank you for being here. Wonderful. Yes?
I'm retired.
Retired? Yes.
20 years. I was former school manager at Savannah River. And I just saw a random ad on Facebook.
Wonderful.
Wouldn't know about it.
Otherwise, right? So that's what we did, right? We posted on a number of social media platforms, and then word of mouth, and then targeted advertising. So I'm glad that once again that you decided to come out and spend Saturday with us. So we'll get to know each other a whole lot better based on the questions and the conversations that we have going forward. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of set the tone, because I know some of you from the raised hands know quite a bit more about the industry, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same kind of plane as we enter into conversation. So when you look at nuclear energy and its contribution to energy production within the United States, it's about 20%. And when you're looking at carbon-free energy, it rises to about 50% overall, right? So it's a kind of a powerhouse that kind of strong and steady 365 days of the year, unless we're down for an outage. And the outage is about 18 months. We're moving around the fuel, and we're putting some fresh fuel into the process itself. And the footprint for it, when compared to some of the other energy sources, is relatively smaller, right? And what does that fuel look like? So we're using uranium as our fuel source. It's enriched. It goes into our fuel assemblies, and a number of those fuel assemblies are gathered together, so that then makes up your fuel rods that then go into your fuel assemblies, and a series of those fuel assemblies that then make up our core. And when you look at the pellets that are enriched, they're about the top part of your pinky, and a series of those go into the rods themselves. When we talk about the core itself, or the fuel assemblies, that will be in operation, and upon completion or depletion, then they are moved into spent fuel pools or onto dry cask storage. And this map we showed before, you're looking at about 70 plus sites across the United States. And that's kind of the decentralized storage process that we're using currently. And we're having these conversations about consolidation, either interim and or longer term. Our mandate is to look at interim storage, right? So the collaboration-based siting for interim storage is a longer title of what the Department of Energy wanted us to take a look at. So we've got these IFC sites, right? So the independent spent storage fuel installations, and there are these dry cask canisters that are positioned on these various concrete slabs. Again, 70 plus of them from approximately 90 of our reactors. And you can do public tours of these particular locations as well. So what's the history of nuclear? Cole's Notes version of it, right? Because it's quite extensive, so to speak, right? So the U.S. nuclear energy program started back in the 40s and 50s. And then when you look at mid-70s, we started to look at exploration of storage beyond the spent fuel pools on site of reactors. And then when you look at, you're looking at early 80s, where we're looking at a Nuclear Waste Policy Act coming into form. Then you had a look at a number of different sites for longer term storage, and Yucca Mountain was part of the number of different sites that we're taking a look at. And it wasn't until 2002 when it was recommended for Yucca Mountain in particular. That was put on pause back in 2009. And then you start to see in the early 2000s, started for us to talk about consent-based siting, collaboration-based siting for our spent fuel. The first draft of that collaboration-based siting document came out in 2017, and then in 2023, the Department of Energy put out a call for proposals, and is funding those 12 consortia to take a look at engagement, what that process looks like moving forward. And we right now, and I know when I came into the industry, there were 104 reactors back in 2001, right? And we have decommissioned some, and we've had the build of some as well. And we're now standing at 94 reactors in the United States that are powered by nuclear. So, what does this program wish to achieve, this new initiative by the Department of Energy? Well, we're trying to engage with as broad a number of constituents, right? Communities, to have a discussion around the use of our energy source and what are we going to do with our byproducts. And to develop a process for that engagement, right? So this is not about actual siting, but the process that we should engage in to consider in the future, right? So this is very much about the process of engagement. And then to help communities to have a discussion around what we're going to do with the spent fuel in way of the siting itself. And then ultimately to build trust so that then we can have a frank and honest and transparent conversation about the process of siting. So the roadmap is long, and we are only in stage 1. And I think that this is our step 1, and this is an important stage for us to be in. And this is where we're planning around the process and capacity building, right? So it's very much about engagement with communities and individuals in particular. So we are leading that charge as mandated or given a process by the Department of Energy, and we're really about that feedback coming from the public, generally speaking. And this is not one way, right? This is mutual learning. So your questions and the comments are essential to how the process evolves. So why did we come to Nevada? Well, Nevada has a rich history with nuclear. And it is a storied one, right? Whether we're talking about uranium mining, or we're talking about the Nevada test site, or we're talking about the proposed and now definitely on hold Yucca Mountain. So where else should we come, right? We've gone to communities where there is no nuclear relationship at all, and others where there are plants or there are non-energy applications of the technology, and had a conversation. So it makes sense that we also come to Yucca Mountain, which has this storied history and a long trajectory when we're talking about either the uranium fuel cycle or the nuclear fuel cycle. So we're going to start to kind of launch in. That was kind of my overview, and I think just kind of getting to know who you are a bit, and we'll get to know each other a whole lot more as we move forward. I would like to reintroduce Scott to the microphone so that we can start talking about the journeys of 2 organizations that make up our consortium.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, you should. Turn that over right now. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Scott Lathrop. I'm a member of the Tichu Yakatahini tribe. Typically, we're also known as Northern Chumash people in the county of San Luis Obispo, California. And you're probably wondering, well, why is there a native person here? Or, why do we have a story? Well, we always say our big claim to fame is that we have a Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant that actually is built on one of our ancestral village sites. So our overall community, tribal community, has been involved with nuclear for well over 40, 50 years. It hasn't been a real good start, but I think it has a positive story as we look at it today. And so what I wanted to do was first kind of set the stage a little bit about what we're going to talk about. You can see that's an aerial shot of Diablo Canyon Power Plant. And you might notice, my pointer's not working. You might notice that next to those 2 pools of water, you'll see the IFC. And those are dry cast storage canisters that are being stored at the plant today. And today there's roughly about 70 of those casts, and there's still room for several more. But the cast that you see there right now represents about 30 to 40 years of power generation for the state of California. And you know, the latest numbers, like 10% of all of California's power comes from this plant, which is a big deal for the state of California. The reason we're here is really we're talking about how do we manage that used fuel. And currently right now the management responsibility is the federal government, and there'll be a little bit more story on how we, how we're dealing with that today. Currently right now the cost of storage is around $12 billion today, and it's growing because we are continuing to generate used fuel. The question really is are we going to continue to leave it at individual sites, or are we going to consolidate it? And if we're going to consolidate it, definitely we have to look at community engagement, simply because of the lessons that we've learned in the past. And then the ultimate goal is to try to identify sites or more sites that may be willing to store the fuel. And so that's kind of like the main story today. But before we can get into our kind of tribal story, what we discovered is that really before you can talk about used fuel storage on a consolidated basis in a community, you really have to talk about the complete life cycle of nuclear power. And as a tribal organization, our tribal community, it's the front end of that story that has been real negative for the tribal groups. And so essentially there's like 3 steps. We have the milling, we have the mining and the milling, then we have the generation, and then we have the storage or reprocessing. So it's really like 3 areas. My story today will center in on more the generation side, because that's what our experience has been. So looking at that, again, we're starting out, it's our shared story. Lots of times we get into our own little silos and we don't understand that we all have a responsibility in reference to what happens with the industry at the mining and milling site, the generation, and then of course the responsibility for the overall storage of used fuel. So again, tribal people are storytellers, and so we're labeling this, it's all of our shared story. And hopefully as we go forward, we can improve on that story. So starting with it, and on a little really high level information, as it relates to tribal communities, whenever you talk about nuclear industry, the very first thing that pops up is Navajo country, because of the negative response, negative things that have happened in the overall Navajo world. In 1948, there was kind of a boom. We all knew that's kind of like the beginning of the race, the nuclear race, if you will. And it just was kind of a fortunate or unfortunate thing. On Navajo land, there's a lot of uranium. And essentially, the government put into place of making uranium mining happen very quickly. You might say a lot of those large incentives, some guaranteed rates and things like that and so it's kind of like a uranium rush, if you will. And at the beginning, with Navajo's lands being opened up and leases issued by the federal government, it essentially seemed like it was going to be a positive thing for the community because it was economic development, providing resource jobs, things of that nature. But the problem going forward is that there wasn't complete community engagement up front to make sure the community understood what this was all about. It was more focused on, let's get the job done, let's go as fast as we can because we have to win this race. Well, the net result of that, we got 3 boxes here. Some of the older people in the room, you might remember the Good, Bad, and the Ugly movie. This is sort of like what's happening in Navajo country. Initially, economic development, hey, that's a good thing. We're going to try to improve people's lives and create jobs. But the problem was the jobs were short-lived. It was, go do the mining, and when we don't need you anymore, it's over with. And there wasn't any kind of follow-up, if you will, as far as economic development. So essentially that's kind of like the good, there was some initial economic development. And then came kind of the bad, because currently today there's over 500 legacy uranium mines that are still there, that need to be cleaned up, and so forth, which is not a good thing. I mean, if that was in your backyard, you probably would not be too excited today. And then even worse, this is the ugly part. There was roughly estimates about 5,000 lives lost due to that whole process in the Indian country. We have the Radiation Exposure Conservation Act, and the problem with that, you have to have an allocation by the Congress every year. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Dollars don't flow to try to make any kind of amends what's happening. And then of course, the big thing with tribal groups, because it's probably the biggest expense to the whole, I want to say, nuclear industry, is the total lack of trust. And if you're coming from Native communities' perspective, that's sort of like the history when you relate to anything happening with the federal government. There's been a real issue of building trust. And so that is something that lingers. I know when I go speak to tribal communities about nuclear, that's the first barrier. It's like, why should we believe you? Why should we even talk about that? So kind of moving on, as we call this kind of lessons learned from the past. Trusted relations. If we're going to deal with tribal communities, and most likely general communities, it's a whole issue of building trust with those communities. And whoever's delivering the message has to be a trusted voice. So it's very important to build that if you're going to do any type of industrial type of project in a community. You have to take the time to build that trust in that community. Community engagement is number one. In the Westernly thinking of development is like fast. Well, if you go a little slow and engage the community, that is going fast. You're going to save you a lot of time and effort down the road. Looking at education for risk and benefit. Any industrial project in your community is going to have risk and it's going to have benefit. And people need to be informed of what those risks and benefits are, so they can make an educated decision going forward if they want something in their community. And then of course you have to have community approval. You have to have the support of the community to do any type of project. So, from the past, these are the lessons I think we've learned. The question is, as we go forward on trying to find a consolidated site, will we take these lessons to heart and moving forward? I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about kind of our tribal story as it relates to Diablo Canyon. But before I do so, I wanted to kind of set the stage as far as where we're coming from. So I thought it would be nice to share a little bit about, I call this the Native World View. And if you can see there, we believe that all of us live in the three realms of the world. And that is, of course, about land, water, and sky. We call that Mother Earth, Father Sky, and water, which is our lifeblood. But we believe that each one of those realms has their own spirit, if you will. And we also believe that we have a relationship with those three realms, not just an experience or use those three realms. So when you think about relationship, it's like your mother, your father, your son, your daughter. You treat your relations a lot better than if you don't have a relationship with someone. So that's kind of like it. We also believe that it's everyone's stewardship responsibility to essentially use those three realms wisely, efficiently, things of that nature. And we're also very much tied to a place of origin. To be a member of my tribe, you have to be able to show your lineage back to a specific village in our territory. If you can't do that, well, the odds are you're not going to become a member of our tribe. And so and because of that, we believe we have a specific stewardship responsibility for that area that essentially we say creator given area. So those are, then the bottom line there, this is, I think, the most important thing, so hopefully you'll take that away when we talk about natural resource management. We have a belief that you're supposed to take very little from the natural resources. You're supposed to maximize that use of that resource and then return very little to Mother Earth, if you will. And that will kind of line up when we start talking about used fuel and use of uranium and things of that nature as we go forward. That's kind of like the tribal flavor coming into that whole industrial kind of relation. Before I go though, I wanted to show you a little bit of my homeland, and because I think what this really shows that we're very much concerned about what happens with the environment, and actually the Apple Canyon kind of fits into the picture quite well. So this will just take a little less than a minute if everything works well. So just take a good look. In reference to that overall video, I think the most important thing is the very last statement, and then it's our shared responsibility as far as the stewardship. You'll notice that we made sure that we got a little picture of the Diablo Canyon Power Plant. Believe it or not, it's a beautiful location. The plant is actually surrounded about 12,000 acres that has been uninhabited, meaning no human access. It's pristine. There's 14 miles of coastline. And here we have this industrial complex in the middle of it, which I want to say Mother Earth or Mother Nature has really kind of accepted and kind of incorporated it all. Our overall tribe relationship with the plant started in '68 or so. That's when the plant was being conceived to be built. There was a lot of demonstrations as far as not wanting the plant to be built there and so forth. At the time, our tribal group really didn't have any power to have anything any say over the matter. It just basically happened. It's actually built on one of our ancestral village sites. But then as you slingshot forward to today, there has been, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because of course we would not have wanted one of our village sites, our ancestors, be denigrated, if you will. But the plant has provided quite a bit of benefit. And the first one I want to talk about is the actual land stewardship. Here's an example, a little graph. You can see the power plant there. It's on what they call a permitted area of about 570 acres, give or take. But the actual plant itself, the footprint is on less than 100 acres. Now look at all the great property around it. And it's actually protecting that property because there's restricted zones. So from a native's perspective, this is kind of a good thing because it has really protected the land area. And then when you take on a bigger, higher level and you look at the different types of generation sources, this is a good thing as far as nuclear. It has the smallest footprint when it comes to land. Well, tribal people, if you're if you're an environmentalist or really want to protect the land, or back to the saying, take little, maximize the use, and return little, it kind of fits into that overall philosophy. And it's pretty amazing the amount of power you can generate out of a fairly small area. I wanted to highlight this a little bit. This is kind of my experience. For 20 years, I was in K-12 education, so I'm kind of into education in general. And whenever we talk about fear, because when we run into different groups related to nuclear groups that come to see us, it's always a question, there's like a fear issue, and like people are kind of scared of nuclear. And so the opposite of fear is education. So in reference to this, knowledge over fear is really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to share that information so people can kind of maybe deal with that. And then we say nuclear awakening. The item over to the left was the first time I ever saw the plant. When I was, I want to say my first career, I was working for the San Luis Obispo County Building Department, and I had an opportunity to go out to the plant at that time when it was under construction. And I was kind of blown away, that's the education part, with when you saw the actual elements that went into the construction of that, the size of the rebar, the size of the concrete dome, all those kinds of things. You know, it kind of eliminated any kind of fear. In fact, my initial thought was, there's a lot of overkill in this construction. Then slingshotting to 2018, I sit on the Diablo Canyon's decommissioning panel. And at one time, the plant was planning to be decommissioned. Well, if you go to that document, which you can find online, it's about 115 page, and it goes over every part of the issue of decommissioning the plant. Of course, one of the major parts is used fuel. What do you do with the used fuel after the plant shuts down? The community desire in San Luis Obispo is that the used fuel should go off-site. It should go somewhere else. That's a problem. As a tribal perspective, my perspective, I don't really have an issue of it being there. And I look at the used fuel as an asset, not a liability, and that's because of the future potential use, through innovation. So I call this my nuclear awakening after sitting on that panel. We learned a lot of information. Just to give you some information about community benefit, there was a study done that if the plant was going to be decommissioned, right now the plant contributes about $1.4 billion to the economy, local and state economy. If the plant was shut down, that economic benefit would go to $15.2 million. That's a gaping, gigantic hole. Again, talking about assets or benefit to the community, it's great. Also, if you take a look at the jobs, it's some of the highest paid jobs in the area. California is not a cheap place to live, and so when you have jobs that are, high level, head of household jobs, that's a really important factor. Just wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening today with the used fuel. It was highlighted earlier. Lisa pointed out that currently right now our plan is to keep it at the local plant. And again, there's around that 70 plus areas. What's interesting is there's approximately 3,800 canisters. You saw a picture of the canister earlier that are all distributed in those places on the map. But what I thought was really interesting is probably the major driver of trying to consolidate. It's costing the federal government about $783 million a year to have paid utilities to store them on their sites. To date, running total to date, is basically $12 billion. And that's coming all out of your guys' pocket because it's all taxpayer money. And it's a direct result of not having like a Yucca Mountain put in place. Because without Yucca Mountain, this is what the cost is going forward. And we're talking about ramping that up. There's going to be more used fuel coming out, meaning so the value is going to go up. So I think that's important that people need to understand. Just to kind of give you a little bit about the past and the future. Yucca Mountain, if you live in the area here, you know what that's all about. Essentially the project was canceled. The question is, why was it canceled? When you really look at the high level, it's because it was a decision made from the top down. And all the experts got together, I guess, and said, this is the best place for this reason or whatever reason. But when it got down to the actual community, there was a problem. That project, I understand it was like 85% designed and ready to go, and it's like 50 or 60% completed for a ticket of about $15 billion. And that doesn't align with tribal thinking, and that is, take little, maximize use, and return little. And so, that was really a failure. Well, why a failure? We're saying it goes back to going from the community, go the opposite direction. You gotta build that community support for whatever you're going to do. So we're looking at the future, consolidated sites, and we're going through this process of trying to inform communities about what needs to happen going forward. Collaboration-based siting for today, we have a shared responsibility. We can't get out of that whole life cycle for fuel. It's everyone's responsibility. And we have to have a solution. Whether you're anti-nuclear or pro-nuclear, we have 3,800 canisters out there that need to be managed and stored. So it's not an issue of pro or not. It's just that we have this storage issue that we need to deal with. Well, one of the good sides is that economic and social benefits, there are some opportunities there for communities that are going to take on, as a willing community. Talking about a little bit of community collaboration, we gotta engage, we gotta build that trust back into communities. We have benefit agreements, community benefit agreements that potentially could be something that's pretty valuable for communities. And then what's on the horizon, what's the next step, is what they call an expression of interest. The Department of Energy is going to be putting out an announcement looking for communities that have an interest in doing this. They'll essentially receive a grant to do more due diligence for the community. And if that's something that they want to proceed with, they can make a proposal to the federal government as being potentially one of these new sites going down the road. This is kind of me, I know nothing official. I kind of see it in actually a 5-step process. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, we're in the collaboration-based setting right now, siting at this time. The expression of interest is expected to come out at the end of this year or next year. After that, there will be community site selection, awarding of some kind of additional work. There's going to be a discussion with that community about community benefits. Because if you're going to store the nation's fuel, there should be some community benefit to that, which is, the door is wide open on that. That's a negotiated item. And then, of course, somewhere along the line, there will be an award of construction of the facility. And so with that, I just want to leave you with this kind of thought, comment. It says, we will be known forever by the tracks that we leave. And so I think it's important that as we take a look at nuclear power in general, we got to do the right thing. We got to move forward in the right way. And that's kind of the end of my little presentation. And we would definitely open it up to any questions that you may have before we move on to the next.
Questions, comments?
Oh, look at the hands go.
Love it.
So you said step one for these nuclear facilities, right, is mining. What are the implications of this uranium mining? 'Cause as far as I'm aware, right, it's like open pit mines, and open pit mines on indigenous lands tend to have.
Well, I think what's important, there's an example in the Blantyre, Utah area. My understanding is the only licensed
Conversation based on the two organizations that are sharing their information. I just wanted also to address the question about uranium mining and the strip mining that is occurring, right? We're taking some lessons learned from Australia in way of revegetation, also back putting back the topsoil, and then also kind of a regreening of the area. So I think about the decommissioned sites for reactors, and there's a greening of that, you know, a clearing and a regreening of that area so that can be used for another purpose. Those sorts of initiatives, kind of leading the way is Australia, but we're taking some lessons learned from that as well. All right. And then also, I just wanted to also just kind of re-emphasize that the decision-making process for siting for, whether you're siting for a reactor or you're siting for the back end of the fuel cycle, it really is a social technical issue, and we're trying to put those two things back together again, especially with this particular consortium and some of the other work that I've seen within the nuclear industry, right? So it is policy, it's economics, and it's also technical. And they're all kind of, you can't really separate any of them, and we see this through the history, through our history within the industry, so to speak. Next up, we have Mothers for Nuclear. We have Heather and Thursday. They will share their personal journeys, and then we'll take some more questions and comments and kind of blend them all together. So, hand this over.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us.
No, you pointed it left.
Right here. Yeah, okay. All right. Mothers for Nuclear is a nonprofit, and our mission is building a global community of support for clean energy, obviously with a focus on nuclear. We're going to talk a little bit about ourselves and our organization, and then also why we're here talking about used fuel. So I'm Heather Hoff. I grew up in the desert of Arizona in a rural setting, very kind of hippie, environmentalist, tree hugger, wanted to save the planet by using less, conserving. I gradually got frustrated with that when I realized that other people didn't really want to use less energy. People want to use more energy and have a better quality of life. The life where I grew up in Arizona, it was kind of hard. We didn't have air conditioning. We had a wood-burning stove and a water well that didn't produce very much. So gradually, I kind of realized that people want more energy, and so that my plan wasn't really working out to save the planet. I got a degree in materials engineering at Cal Poly, and then kind of happened upon a job at a local nuclear power plant. I was very skeptical. I went in with a lot of questions, and took about 6 years to kind of change my mind and realize that nuclear supported my environmental and humanitarian values. So I've been there 21 years now at the Apple Canyon. I work as an operator and a procedure writer. And here's Thursday.
Hi, I'm Thursday Bunk. So sorry about the formatting on the day of going to the projector, but I grew up in Surf City, USA. That's Huntington Beach, California, Southern California. So I grew up roaming the beach and estuaries and wetlands, and was taught from an early age that those things are important, should be conserved and preserved, and will be recycled, and I cared a lot. But I didn't know much more than that. I cared about my community and the planet, but I really had no idea how to help more than recycling or beach cleanups. So I knew I wanted to help the planet and the people that lived on it, but I wasn't quite sure how. So when I was in college, I studied physics and learned that physicists can work in the energy industry. And I learned that, that's important, that energy efficiency and having cleaner energy and more access to energy is really important for people around the world. And I got really excited. I was like, maybe this is the way that I can help my community and the globe as much as possible. So yeah, here I am today. I get to work for Mothers for Nuclear and engage with communities across the US, like you guys, and talk about our energy options, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, so we're really excited to be here with you chatting, and just a little bit about us at Mothers for Nuclear. We're mothers, women, nature lovers, believers in a clean and just future. And some of the things that we care about are these that Fair State's going to talk about.
So this first picture on your left is the world at night. As you can see, there's some brighter areas. These are people with their lights on at night. And there's still large swaths of dark area, people that don't have access to electricity the same way that we do here in Las Vegas or largely in the US. But as you can see, there's still dark spots even here in the US. So energy access is directly related to our quality of life. It's important for refrigeration, for hospitals, for lights on, having this presentation here today. And so it's really important to us as an organization that people across the globe have the same access to energy that we do. But when it comes to industrializing, developing energy specifically, there's trade-offs. So this is a picture from Pittsburgh in the 1940s around steel production. There's a lot of pollution. The air quality there was really terrible, as you can see in that photo. And that's a problem we haven't solved today. This is Los Angeles last year, still heavily polluted. As you can see, there's lots of people that die every year from air pollution. And the energy industry is not free from adding to that. The other less localized effect that some energy production can have from emissions is climate change. That affects the entire world. So as we emit more CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases, communities around the world, the globe's climate is greatly affected. Sea levels rise, hurricanes become more frequent, etc. And we care about these things because they impact the people on this planet.
Yeah, so those are a lot of the things that motivate me to try and solve our human problems. And when we look at what can we do about those problems and we look at our world energy, it becomes obvious that we have a long way to go. We still use a huge portion of energy sources that have really high emissions that contribute to that climate change, that air pollution. And we still don't have enough energy for all the world's people, like that world at night slide showed. So what are we going to do about this situation? It's pretty complicated. We care about protecting the nature around us as we do this and as we go forward. What are we going to do, Fair State?
So we have a lot of options, right, for building out our energy portfolio. Here are just a few of them and some of the trade-offs involved with developing each one. I'll go through it a little bit. So we have solar and wind, also known as our renewables. These have less of those greenhouse emissions, which is really exciting for people who care about climate change, which leads to very high public support. It's kind of the new big thing, how we produce energy without emissions. But it is intermittent, meaning it relies on the weather, so it's not a consistent 24/7 base load of energy. It depends on if the sun's out or if the wind's blowing. It also takes up a lot of land to maximize the usage of the weather and the sun. And then there's hydro. So hydro also has low emissions. But if you know anything about beavers, dams can have serious ecological impacts still, with trapping sediment or displacing fish populations, etc. And coming from California, very dry state, we don't have the water access or capacity to increase our hydro capabilities. It also uses a decent amount of land. On the previous graph we saw earlier, it's not the most, but it's not negligible. And then we've got fossil fuels. We've used this for like centuries now. We know that it works. We've been able to innovate, so it's reliable and it's cheap. It's safer than it used to be, but it's still not 100% safe. We have existing infrastructure, but this is one of our leading causes of emissions, so air pollution as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have nuclear, which is what we're talking about primarily today. It's clean and low carbon. It's got that 24/7 base load that I talked about earlier in contrast to renewables, so it's running all the time. But there's a high upfront cost. We've talked a bit today about the economics behind nuclear energy. Not everybody's interested in that initial payment nor continuing. It doesn't have a lot of public support. And we have to manage the waste. It's one of the only energy production industries that is 100% responsible for the waste that it produces. So all of these produce waste to some degree, but nuclear itself is federally, like by law, required to completely handle and contain all of its waste. And that's something that we all have to figure out.
So we're trying to give you a sense of all the things that we care about and how we balance this conversation going forward and why nuclear is so important to that conversation. I mentioned that I took a long time to change my mind about nuclear working at Diablo Canyon, but eventually realized all those things. Scott's already talked about them, Thursday just talked about them. Nuclear is pretty amazing. This one plant where I work at Diablo Canyon makes 10% of California's electricity. That's huge. So nuclear has to be a part of the conversation. And that is largely why we started Mothers for Nuclear. We realized there's this huge public perception issue with people not seeing that value message about nuclear energy. And why is that? For me, I went to work at Diablo Canyon. It still took me years and years of asking questions to kind of understand all the fear, that I had, and lack of digestible information out to the public, that there's not a whole lot out there. Nuclear plants kind of fly under the radar, operating very reliably, quietly, trying not to attract attention. We've historically had a lack of trusted messengers from our industry that, don't share with people who might be skeptical like me. Mothers and women might have questions, and then a corporate spokesperson comes out and says, we're so safe because we have all these barriers and separation of trains and redundancy. It doesn't necessarily make me feel better about nuclear. And then our pop culture has a lot of fear-mongering and misinformation. So on the left, that's me at Diablo Canyon, near our switchyard, and that's Kristen Zaitz, co-founder of Mothers for Nuclear. She's doing containment inspections on top of the dome there. And what we do differently at Mothers for Nuclear is share in a different way than our industry historically has. Nuclear communications like a mother, right? We're gonna ask questions, we're gonna listen with empathy to concerns. We're not going to, answer right away with a technical, here's how the plant works, or here's how radiation will or won't kill you. It's a little terrifying. We're gonna, get to the root of people's concerns, share our stories, share warmth and compassion while we're talking about nuclear. So we're going to try and do that a little bit differently.
Yeah, so Heather and Kristen, founding Mothers for Nuclear, have really become the trusted messengers that they wish they had seen when they first entered the industry. So we have gone across the United States, they've even gone across the ocean to other countries to engage with different communities and talk about nuclear and ask questions. And that's why we're here today. We want to know what you have to say, what your concerns are, and we really want to truly engage as much as possible.
So why are we talking about used fuel storage today? We're just getting into it a little bit. Just like nuclear generally, and how I took a long time to change my mind, there's so much misinformation about used fuel and nuclear waste. I grew up with The Simpsons. I think a lot of you here probably have seen it. Glowing green barrels of ooze, and here's the nuclear plant executives hiding waste, in the forest, and there's a lot of information out there that's not reality. It might be funny, but it also kind of sticks in people's minds is that there's something probably nefarious happening over at the nuclear plant. So we're participating in this program to help share a different story, a more true story, and to also humanize it, to not just make it about dry casks. But here's some of our friends, some lovely ladies, posing by the dry cask storage. That's Paris over at Palo Verde on the left, and Alyssa at San Onofre. And this is our friend Maddie. She's actually pregnant in that shot, standing right by a canister of used fuel, which sounds terrifying. But as an operator, I'm one of the few who's gone through pregnancy at Diablo Canyon. That makes me scared. Looking at that picture makes me scared, but I have to recognize my own emotions and then kind of pivot to the facts and the data and the trusted experts that tell me, what the risk is and that's okay. And so we're here to share a little bit of different context around used fuel.
in general, you know, globally, in the United States, in California, in Nevada, we need more energy. And that's a really complicated process. You know, in nuclear in particular, as we've discussed today, we already have existing used fuel, we have a legal obligation to manage, and we need to continue to do so. As we grow our energy industry, whether that's nuclear or not included, we have to continue to manage that as well. So we have a lot to do moving forward, and it's going to look different for every individual, every community, every state, and every country, truly. So what we're here to do today, what we're here doing next, is to really truly engage with each of you as individuals, as communities, to really see what you think, what you feel, so we know what we should do going forward.
We don't want the question, what about the waste, to keep getting in the way of nuclear. And so thank you. These are all real mothers and women, you know, not clip art, who support nuclear energy, and we're eager to engage and have conversations about it. So thank you, and we can do some questions. You want to have questions for us? Yeah, where the tribes and the mothers are typically people not supporting nuclear energy, so we're trying to build a different kind of trust here, yes.
So there's around 3,800 canisters of that nuclear waste, right? So besides just storing it in America, what is our alternative? Like offshoring it, or?
Yeah, so I think we have a few different paths forward. He's asking what are the options for just storing used fuel in the United States. We kind of have an idea of the map that Lisa showed, where we have temporary storage all around the country.
Introduce Dr. Hayes, and he's going to say a little bit about himself. But he's a faculty member at North Carolina State's Nuclear Engineering Program. He's also a certified health physicist, and he does work on the back end of the fuel cycle. Without kind of stealing any more of his thunder, I'm going to pass the mic on to him.
Thank you, Lisa. So I spent 15 years in industry before I came over to academia. Spent 10 years in college, and when I was in industry, I spent a number of years at the waste isolation pilot plant doing geological disposal of radioactive waste. There was transuranic waste. I had some stories. I'll actually share one of those stories with you. I actually used to even live here in Vegas. My office was over there in Nellis doing radiological emergency response. So I was on the teams that did that. It was my old team that went to Fukushima. And even when I was at the waste isolation pilot plant, even there I served on the radiological assistance program as a team scientist. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about isn't just the stuff I teach, it's stuff I've done research in. And as Lisa said, I'm a certified health physicist. That means that I've got the American Board of Health Physics has certified me as an expert in radiation safety or radiological protection. I also have my professional engineering license in nuclear, so that means by law you can trust my calculations for your safety. So that means technically. I'm also a fellow of the Health Physics Society, and I'm a fellow of the American Physical Society, the professional society for physicists. And I'm also an associate editor for radiation physics and chemistry. And I am the administrator at North Carolina State University for our undergraduate minor in health physics and our graduate certificate in health physics. So I teach those classes, I administer the program, and so that's kind of my role there at NC State. And I got some nice pictures of my toys here. Lisa wouldn't say this, well, she probably would. I have the coolest lab on campus. So if you're ever in Raleigh and you want to see the coolest lab on campus, you can ask my students, they're probably biased, but they'll acknowledge that. That's the coolest lab on campus. The toys that I have are really fun toys. Sorry? Yes, they're very fun toys. Electron paramagnetic resonance spectrometer and thermoluminescence, not stimulated luminescence spectrometry. Very cool stuff. I do magic with that stuff. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start off with just going over nuclear fuel, the fuel cycle. Then we're going to talk about used nuclear fuel, and then what is sometimes people's favorite part, radiation risk in context. So I'm going to contextualize radiation risk. That's basically my specialty, radiation risk. I'm going to contextualize that for everybody. And then we're going to talk about energy landscape, and then things to do that are often a concern for people, terrorism, accidents, those kinds of things. And then we're just going to finish with where we are right now with the Department of Energy's progress in terms of transporting and in terms of spent fuel storage. So this first slide is really basic, but it's really important because pretty much almost everything I'm going to say after this is predicated on what I have in this slide. What we have here on the left is a fission. I'm taking uranium-235 nucleus and I'm fissioning it. I'm splitting it into two separate nuclei, and it also spits out a small handful, a few neutrons, 2 or 3 neutrons, high energy neutrons, that then go off to create subsequent fission for a chain reaction. Now the reason why I have that up there is because almost everything I'm going to say, as I said, is going to be predicated on what we see here on the left. On the left, you see that when I fission a uranium-235 nucleus, I get 200 million electron volts of energy when I do that. That heat per atom. It's a fantastic amount when you compare that to basically any chemical process. Any chemical process includes combustion of fossil fuels. If I'm combusting fossil fuels or any other chemical process, I'm just rearranging, for all intents and purposes, the valence electrons of the materials that are being a part of that process, and including combustion. So when I combustion something like natural gas, it's one of the most clean forms of fossil fuel that there are, but it still is a greenhouse gas emitter. Even there, I only get out about 1 electron volt per atom of all the atoms that are taking place. So that is just a fantastic difference. 200 million electron volts per atom with fission versus about 1 electron volt per atom with combustion. And so what this is going to do is this is literally the technical basis for pretty much everything else I'm going to say, for the most part. A completely astronomical difference in energy density. And it all comes down to that, the energy density. So if I were to talk about fusion, with fusion I get about 10 billion electron volts per atom. But if I look at it in terms of atomic mass units, which we'll talk about again later, with uranium I get about 1 million electron volts per atomic mass unit. But when I talk about fusion, I'm getting multiple million electron volts per atomic mass unit. It's just energy density. And what we'll see as we go through this, I'm going to make the claim now, we'll see as we go through this, that every promise that you have from fusion, all of the benefits that you have from fusion, I'm going to show you we can have that today, right now, with fission. So if you think fusion is attractive, everything that's attractive from fusion comes from this left-hand side here. It's energy density. Fusion has incredibly high energy density, as does fission. It's a form of nuclear energy. It's that energy density that makes it attractive. And we'll see why as we go through this. Now, a little bit more about the nuclear physics that we're going to need to talk about nuclear waste disposal. That might sound strange, but it'll make sense when we get there, is what happens when I fission something. When I fission something, I get a distribution of isotopes. So you see here up in the top right, a number of different possible fission reactions, right? Fission, a uranium-235, and I get out different isotopes. These different isotopes, as you see in this is basically a histogram, this curve that we have here, is you see that I tend to get a lot of isotopes with a mass number around 90, and a lot of isotopes with a mass number around 140. And I get a distribution. Now this is linear, so I actually do get isotopes that have that look like they're 0 here. These actually aren't zeros, they're just extremely small compared to these big lobes that we have here. So I get a distribution of these isotopes when I do fission, and that's basically the fission products. And we'll come back to that later. But we need to know this for some of the science that we're going to be talking about later. This is largely just going to be like a science lecture. In fact, when I do my sophomore health physics class, this is largely the lecture that I start with. And so this is going to be, for all intents and purposes, my attempt at doing a college lecture that is intended to be digestible for the general public. And you can judge me on how successful I am when you do the survey at the end. All right, so the fuel cycle. Historically, you go and you dig a hole. You dig a hole, you then take that dirt and you crush it very, very fine. You make it virtually powder. You take dirt and you crush it so fine in a milling process that you basically throw it on water and it will all flow. It's all powder. And then you have to leach it. You have to separate out the mineral component from the silicon. right? Most of it's gonna be sand. You don't want the sand is useless, but you want the mineral component that was there, and so you gotta dissolve that out. You gotta separate out that mineral component. Once you've done that, then you've got this U308. Once you've refined it, the yellow cake, the U308, which then has to get converted to uranium hexafluoride, the UF6. Once I have the UF6, then we can do enrichment, where I separate out the fissile from the fertile components. The fissile component, uranium-235, it's only about 0.7% natural enrichment. When I dig it up from the dirt, the amount that will actually fission from a thermal neutron, it's only about 0.7%. The rest of it's uranium-238, which is not fissile. And so when I convert it to this uranium hexafluoride, I can enrich it using a centrifuge. Basically, we used to do it with diffusion. Back when we made the first bomb, we used electromagnets. But the point is that we're separating them out based on their mass. Uranium-235 has 235 neutrons and protons, and uranium-238 has 238 neutrons plus protons. And so one's heavier than the other, and so we use that mass difference to separate them. Once they're separated, then we convert the uranium hexafluoride into uranium dioxide, and then we sinter it. So we basically make it a ceramic. And once it's a ceramic, then that's what we do in the fuel production. Then it goes into a nuclear reactor, it makes heat, boils water to make electricity. And then right now, the current book, the law on the books is that it goes into a geological repository. Now, the executive orders have said we need to start focusing on recycling, so hopefully that's going to happen. But if that doesn't take place, then we may end up just going into a geological repository. That's the goal right now. Although I have yet to meet a nuclear engineer that doesn't want to recycle it, because you've got over 90% of the energy still there. You just got to recycle it. You went through all of this trouble back here at the beginning of the fuel cycle. You put forth all that energy, and then we just throw it away. That's why Scott said it doesn't make sense. And there's so many other uses that you can have for all of these other isotopes. There's a lot of those isotopes that have medical uses and other industrial uses, should we choose to use those, but it requires that we have to do this reprocessing step to take advantage of those very unique isotopes that are available there. Well, what is this magical thing called nuclear energy? How does that work? Why is that so scary? Well, what we do is we basically just boil water. So the same thing that applies with any other thermal plant. With a thermal plant, that would be geothermal, that would be oil, natural gas, coal. All of those are thermal plants. The same thing would be done with fusion. All we do is we have a heat source, and we boil water that then goes and expands in a turbine. That turbine, while the gas is expanding, causes it to turns a dynamo, which makes electricity that then goes and provides the electricity that we enjoy. That water, once it went through the turbine, it's going to be, it's no longer going to be gaseous water. It's going to be very wet steam. And in order to make the cycle continue, that wet steam has to be condensed into pure water before it can go back in and take the heat out. Now, that condensing process, that requires that you remove the heat from it. And that reduces the total efficiency of how much energy was in the water, because we've got to take some of that energy out to make it wet again, make it water again, and go back in and boil. Now, two ways of doing that historically. You can do it with, say, a local body of water. You dump the heat into that local body of water, like an ocean or a river. Or you can use cooling towers. Or you can do something that's even more innovative, like they have at Palo Verde in Arizona, the nuclear power plant that provides energy for Phoenix in the middle of the desert, Great Western Desert out here. And they use gray water from the city. Imagine that. So they didn't do either of those. And plus they're also advanced cooling towers. But the point is there are two actual reactor types. One where we actually boil the water in the reactor and then cycle it through. And another one where we have two cycles. One where we keep liquid water in the primary cycle, and then we have a secondary cycle where we boil the water. The point is that all we're doing is boiling water. Boiling water to make steam, to turn a turbine, to make electricity. That is the process of nuclear energy. That's how we make electricity with nuclear technology. It's been pointed out before that these casks are there whether we make any more electricity or not. If we choose to shut down every nuclear power plant, decommission them all, we still have to have a solution for the waste. And just opposing all solutions means that you basically don't have a solution. It's as simple as that. We either have a solution or we don't. And if we oppose anything, then we're not going to have anything. There's not going to be a solution. So we're going to talk about some of the solutions that have been offered, what the scientific community promotes and endorses. But the point is that this is what we have today, whether we make any more electricity or not. We have used nuclear fuel, and it needs a solution. So the process, once we have the uranium dioxide, we literally turn it into a ceramic. We sinter it. So it's just a ceramic. It's just not a ceramic that's made out of silicates and porcelain that we're more familiar with. It's just a different ceramic. It's a different kind of rust, but it's pure. The uranium dioxide, and it goes into these rods, these cylindrical rods that are made of zircaloy. It's a very special kind of metal that has a low thermal neutron absorption cross-section. But the point is that once it goes into those, it goes into the bundles go into the reactor, and then they end up going into these casks. And these casks, as you can see, they're quite large, about 10 meters high. And these casks, as you've seen other photos, they're heavily shielded. The fuel doesn't even go into one of those casks unless it's been in a cooling pond for 5 to 10 years. And so most of the radioactivity is already decayed away. And all that you get at this point is basically cesium. External dose rate is largely just cesium that you get there. We'll talk about that later on as well. But the point is that these things are incredibly passive. They're incredibly passive, and we'll talk about the testing criteria that's required in order to get a license. Now, to contextualize how much used nuclear fuel we have. Now, it's easy to cast this in a light that makes it sound horrific, that makes it sound mountainous, right? 90,000 metric tons. That just seems phenomenal, gargantuan, unsurmountable. Well, let's contextualize that. The United States has received about 20% of its electricity for the past 50 years from nuclear energy. 20%, the biggest economy on the planet, a manufacturing powerhouse. 20% of our electricity for 50 years, that is huge. And all of the used nuclear fuel from all of that energy would not fill up a single football field above 10 meters high. All the casks of all that nuclear fuel would fit within a single football field. That's how bad it is. It comes back, and the reason why is energy density. You get a massive amount of energy for a very tiny amount of fuel. A very tiny amount of materials gives you a huge benefit, which is, in my personal interpretation, of native values being endorsed. That you get a huge benefit. You treat the earth like a family. I love the way that Scott puts that. Right? Family members work, they produce, they contribute, but they're loved, and they're cherished, and they're cared for. What does it take to get a license for one of these casks? If you're going to put fuel, used nuclear fuel in a cask legally, you have to take an exact, complete manufactured design of what you're submitting your license for. It's got to go through these sequential tests, the same cask. Starts off, you got to drop it 30 foot onto an unyielding surface. You've got to do a finite element analysis and say, what is the weakest point on that cask that I can drop it? Dead drop, bam, loaded drop, and it can't leak. 30 feet onto concrete or asphalt, and it can't leak. And then, you got to do a 40-inch drop onto a steel bar, bam, again on the weakest point, and it can't leak. Then, after all of that, almost 1,500 degrees for half an hour. That's a lot more than a bonfire. that is a huge fire. And then that same cask then has to go underwater, 50 foot of water for 8 hours, and it can't leak. And I can say this as a nuclear engineer. When we design nuclear systems, the design specification is that the worst thing that can possibly happen is that nobody gets hurt. That's how we design things. The worst thing that's allowed to happen for the worst case accident is that nobody gets hurt. Everybody walks home the same way they walked out of their door. And the reason why that this fits that paradigm is that this was considered to be the worst hypothetical accident conditions you could come up with. Basically, you get into a highway accident, this thing's traveling down the road. It falls off a cliff, 40 foot, wham! Onto something down there. And then it falls onto a sharp boulder, wham! And then, well, whatever the accident was, it included being in a tunnel fire. there was a tractor trailer running diesel or gasoline, and that thing ignited, and it burned the cast. Well, in the process of putting out the fire, it fell into a lake. They pushed it into a lake. And that's considered to be the worst thing that could possibly happen as this thing's traveling down the road. And if all of that occurs, it can't leak. These things are not indestructible. They're virtually indestructible, but they're not indestructible. You could destroy one of these. And I can say, as a certified health physicist and a licensed engineer, I can say my personal and professional opinion, I would much rather a terrorist target one of these than an apartment building, or a bus, or a cafe. Because if these go rolling down the highway, they'll terrify people. But I would much rather see people be terrified than dead. Because these are destructible. They're just virtually indestructible. Now, one of the arguments that I've heard a lot people offer for why we should not allow nuclear energy to propagate is because we have no solution for the waste. That's a very common statement. What about the waste? That one phrase for many people is a showstopper. Well, truth is, we have figured out how to do that. I used to work at this place, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. I'll tell you a story about what happened when I was there here in a couple slides. This facility got its license from the Environmental Protection Agency in 1999. It's been operating ever since. It receives contact handled and remote handled transuranic waste. And the reason why is because it's got great geology. It's located in southeast New Mexico. This is where it's at, and you can see kind of a cutaway view of the stratigraphy. It's very impressive. This on the left, I like that because it's a miner operating a miner in a mine. So this gentleman, he's a licensed miner, he's a certified miner by the state of New Mexico, and he's operating with a belly box, is remotely controlling this miner that's mining out the salt in the wood facility. It's a mine, it's an underground salt mine. And if you look at the stratigraphy, you can see it's about in the middle of about a mile thick of salt. Now most of this is sodium chloride, the lighter stuff, but this other stuff is going to be calcium sulfate, calcium carbonates. Basically, water evaporites from an ancient lake formation. Basically, it would fill and dry, fill and dry, fill and dry, until you got about a mile thick. And so that's what we would define to be a good example of stable geology. The salt grains that it's made of, they range from like table salt grains up to about the size of the tip of your thumb, or something like that. And so at this depth, under those massive lithostatic pressures, the salt behaves in a way that's called elastoplastic. It heals itself, so it doesn't build up stress or strain. It simply moves. And so, in that sense, it's incredibly stable geologically. Well, on Valentine's Day of 2014, when I was working there, this happened. So what is that? Well, that's the result of these drums you see here. Los Alamos National Laboratory sent us a drum that, for all intents and purposes, exploded and was an incredibly efficient dirty bomb. It aerosolized 7 curies of americium. And you probably don't know what a curie is. If you do, that's fine. It's a lot. It's a lot. And so 7 curies of americium was aerosolized in the mine. Now, I love this photo right here simply because, and I'm the one actually that did the consequence assessment. I was the one that did that. So that's my paper right here. They characterized the consequences. What was the magnitude of the consequences that occurred as a result of that drum deflagration that occurred? And this gentleman right here, this is really lovely to see when you're in there. The guy that's operating the fork truck, he's not looking at anything other than the hands of the spotter. The spotter is, for all intents and purposes, remotely controlling the fork truck because the spotter is looking right at the ground where the drum is, and he's telling him tilt and position the whole way, so that the spotter is actually controlling the fork truck. The fork truck is just looking at the guy's hands, and it's a very well choreographed process because the real estate here is something like $10,000 per square foot, and so you really want to maximize that, and that's how they do that. They just get those drums just right up there, so they just barely kiss, and then they put it down, and it's just an optimization process. But it's quite a ballet to see. But this over here, this looks like The Simpsons. 2014 on Valentine's Day, the drum deflagrated and caused that. That looks terrifying. That terrified people. They wanted to evacuate 50 miles away. It was in many people's mind, apocalyptic. This result right here actually was exactly what was the worst case that you could possibly have happen. And what happened from this release, if you go back and look at the science of what I did, the americium that was released into the environment, that played it out right there, it just about doubled the amount of americium that was there from atmospheric nuclear weapons testing in the past century. You might not know this, but the rest of the country has had nuclear fallout on it this entire century, and a large part of the last half of the last century, because the nuclear powers were doing atmospheric nuclear weapons tests over the Pacific and elsewhere. And that covered the Earth with fallout. And that fallout included americium. And the americium that was on the ground right there before this event was just about doubled. How scary is that? Kind of help contextualize it. In fact, if this release had been planned and controlled, it would have been a small fraction of their license. You might say, well, what's the license? We'll talk about that soon. But it would have been a negligible chunk of their annual limit on what they were legally allowed to release, like any nuclear facility, like a nuclear medicine facility, a hospital, a university, whatever. There are limits to how much you can release in order to make electricity, how much waste that you're allowed to legally release. Another issue that people have is, well, how do you know, I got this thing here at the whip, this stratigraphy here, how do you really know that's going to be safe in 10,000 years, 100,000 years, a million years? How do you know, right? Recorded history doesn't go back more than 10,000 years, something like that. So how do you know that this stuff is going to be safe in the eons to come? Well, we have this quintessential example. There's a uranium mine in Oakland, Gabon. Gabon, you can see here in this inset, it's in Africa. They're on the Pacific side, and there's a uranium mine. And in that uranium mine, they found that fissile component, uranium-235, was less than the expected 0.7%. They'd never seen this anywhere else on the planet. It was weird. And then they went and they looked closer. And what they found was something very strange. So I've also done research on this as well. This is my paper here as well. So what they found is that if you look at the isotopic distribution, I showed you that one of the first slides, the different isotopes that are created when you do fission. What they found is that the isotopics were completely different there in Oakland, Gabon than you find anywhere else on the planet. Here's an example. So neodymium, it's got 60 protons. Now with those 60 protons, it can have different numbers of neutrons in the nucleus and still be stable and not be radioactive. There are a large number of them. What we see here up in the top left on this bar graph is a histogram of the isotopics from natural neodymium. You go and dig under your feet right now or anywhere else on the planet, if you look at the neodymium that's going to be in the dirt, the isotopic distribution is going to follow this histogram. So if I do a weighted average of this histogram, say it goes from 142 up to 150, if I do a weighted average, then I'm going to get this number right here for the mass number of neodymium, 144.242. That's the average of all of those. Just a weighted average for that histogram. Okay, that's basic chemistry. But what they found at Oklo was completely different. This right here, in the bottom left, that's what they saw at Oklo. It's like, how in the world does that happen? You don't get that isotopic distribution, that mix, anywhere on the planet. It was completely unique. How does nature do isotopic separation? It doesn't, in general. But what they found here is that if you compare that to the terminal neodymium isotopes from uranium-235 fission, this top right is if I do fission, if I use nuclear fuel and I let it all decay back down into stables, the distribution of neodymium that I'll get is going to be shown right there in that top right. So if I take the natural distribution, I subtract from it what we have in Oklo, what I get is basically a statistically indistinguishable distribution from fission product terminal decay. What that tells us is that Mother Nature made her own natural nuclear reactor a few billion years ago and just buried it in the ground until it decayed down into a different kind of dirt. Well, how does that happen? How do you get a natural nuclear reactor? It comes down to half-lives. So the fissile component of uranium-235, has a half-life of about 700 million years. Now that might sound like a lot, But it's actually it's actually quite small compared to the fertile, the non-fissile component. Uranium-238, it's got a half-life of about 4.5 billion years. So uranium-238, the half-life is about the age of the Earth. So since the Earth was formed, we've lost about half of the uranium that we started with. But we've lost a lot more of the uranium-235, which is kind of much shorter half-life. So if you go forward in time, radioactivity decays exponentially. If you go backwards in time, it increases exponentially. So about 2 billion years ago, the natural enrichment of uranium found in the Earth would have been about 5%. 5% enriched uranium is what we use for commercial nuclear fuel today. So 2 billion years ago, geology, through water and through magma and those things, had enriched a location there in Gabon of uranium. And the water that came down from the water table was able to trickle in, make it go critical, and boil back out. So over millions of years, Mother Nature had a rather substantial fission product creation there. And literally, she buried the fuel in the dirt in such a way that it decayed down into a different kind of dirt that we could go back and check it today. And if you look at the literature, I showed this in my paper and it's in other papers, this is the quintessential evidence that the laws of physics have not changed for at least 2 billion years. Because this is the empirical smoking gun that the fine structure constant has not changed in at least 2 billion years. The fine structure constant is just a ratio of the forces of nature, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force. You get all of those in fission and radioactive decay. And in order for this to have occurred, that had to be the same 2 billion years ago as it is today. What that means is for at least 2 billion years, the laws of physics have not changed. And we have proof. But it's because Mother Nature showed us how to dispose safely of used nuclear fuel and keep it separate from the biosphere until it literally just decays down into a different kind of dirt. Well, where does all of the radiation that we get come from in life? Oh, but look at that, there's a banana. I told one of my students I don't talk about bananas. I've actually never talked about bananas, but what I am going to talk about, yes, my students were right. Imagine that. What I am going to talk about is where do we get radiation dose as U.S. citizens? Where do we get radiation dose? We get it from basically two sources. One is medical, and the other is natural. On average, we get about 625 millirem per year from all sources combined. Now you can see about half of that is natural. All the stuff on the right, the green stuff, that's just natural. And all the stuff on the right, that's anthropogenic. All the anthropogenic sources. And the biggest chunk of natural comes from radon and thoron, the decay products. So because you're walking around without a respirator, you're getting about 200 millirem a year inside your lung and inside your body because of the radon decay products that are in the air. Especially, it gets even worse on the Colorado Plateau, which you get out like granite with those uranium inclusions. But the point is that this is where the biggest chunk of our dose comes from. And you can see way up at the top, the industrial. Now that includes industrial, that includes density gauges, well logging, blood irradiators, anything that has a commercial use for anything that's radioactive is industrial. And that's less than 0.1%. That includes nuclear energy. And of all of this that's on there, there are many people for whom that's the only one that's terrifying. Living near a nuclear power plant. And it's less than 0.1%. But it terrifies people. Because you don't know. Well, what is it that you don't know? So let me give you an example. I'm going to help you see through the eyes of people that are terrified of nuclear. You may very well even be one, so this may resonate with you quite well. If I told you that you did something yesterday that cost you being given a dose of 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram. You'd be like, what the fuck? What in the world is that? What did I do to get 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram? Well, if you go through the math, what you'll find is if it's gamma and beta, that's equivalent to 1 millirem. And I can tell you what you did. You lived. Because that's about the dose you get from all natural sources combined. This bit over here, it's about 310 millirem per year. All the natural sources, this fraction of the 625. This is about 310 over here. So in one day, you get about a millirem, which is 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram. The issue the reason why I brought that up, 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram, is that's gobbledygook. That's just some random unit intentionally made to mislead you in thinking that it could be horrific. I mean, who knows? What's 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram? What is that? I don't know. I mean, I actually do know, but as a general rule, you're not. The same would apply with a milligram. If I told you you had a milligram, most people would be like, okay, is that bad? Is that dangerous? I don't know, right? I don't know. 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram. It's equivalent. It literally is the same thing. Literally. But when you realize that this is basically what you get simply because you're alive, the price of walking around the planet without a respirator on your face, without being deep underground so you're shielding off space, and terrestrial, and isotopically separating out your food or something like that, that's about what you get. It's about a milligram per day. Now we'll come back to this. Now I'm going to do something. This is where we go over radiological risk in context. I'm going to do what's called a logarithmic scale. I'm going to start going up by many factors. So I'm not going to do a linear scale. So I'm going to multiply by 5 and then 2 and then multiply by 5 and 2. We're just going to increase really, really fast. And so we're going to talk about risk. So think in your mind, what is the risk from a milligram? In principle, you should say this is about as innocuous as you can get. This is the price for being healthy. Literally. If you're alive, well, I guess you can be unhealthy and still get this, but this is what you get just because you're alive. 5 milligrams. So multiply by 5, then I'm going to multiply 2, and then 5, and then 2. So 5 milligrams. 1 milligram, that's about what you get just from a bite-wing X-ray. Your daily dose from all sources combined. 5 milligrams, that's about the dose you get from cosmic radiation if I do a coast-to-coast flight from LA to New York and back. About 5 milligrams. It's about the dose I get from a panoramic X-ray from the back. So if I'm doing an X-ray of all my teeth all at once, it's about 5 milligrams. Is that scary? Probably not, right? Coast-to-coast trip and back, round trip, that doesn't sound scary at all. Well, what if I told you that that's the annual limit for how much radioactivity can be in your water and you can legally still drink it? Now what that means is that if you have one source of water, that's the only source of water you have all year, the amount of radioactivity that's in that water cannot give you a cumulative dose of more than 5 milligrams per year. Now 5 milligrams might sound pretty terrifying, especially if you find out that you violated the regulatory limit for radioactivity in drinking water. That could be terrifying, right? If you found out that the water you've been drinking violated federal regulations for water standards, oh my goodness, that could be terrifying, right? That could be terrifying. And yet, it's literally the same dose you get coast-to-coast flight. Am I going over? I'm nowhere near being finished. Nowhere near being finished. 10 milligram. 10 milligram is the dose that you get from internal potassium if you're a child or small petite female. Potassium is naturally radioactive. Potassium is in the same chemical family as cesium. Cesium is the dominant external radiation field that you get from used nuclear fuel in a used nuclear fuel catalyst. But potassium has a higher energy beta and a higher energy gamma than cesium. And you will die without it. Potassium is required to be concentrated in the cells, whereas sodium is concentrated in the extracellular fluid. And you have to have a gradient, a strong gradient, in order to get water in and out of your cells. It's called the sodium-potassium pump. And so potassium scales with cell content. The more cells you have, the more potassium you have. So if you're a bigger person, you're going to have more of it. But 10 milligrams is the minimum that you can get from internal potassium. It's also the off-site effluent dose limit from a nuclear facility. So if I have a nuclear power plant, university, nuclear medicine facility, anything like that, the maximum amount of effluent, air, radioactivity in air that I can release cannot give more than 10 milligrams to the nearest resident by law. That would terrify you. If you found out that the nuclear facility down the road violated the effluent standards, the regulatory limit, they broke the law in terms of radioactivity in the air that went to you, that would be terrifying. 10 milligrams, that's the limit. That's the regulatory limit for effluent off-site releases that any nuclear facility can legally do in the United States. So that could be terrifying if it's air, but if it's potassium, that's essential to life. You will die without it. 40 milligrams, that's about what a large male would get. So if you were like, was it Mr. Olympia or whatever, right? You're gonna get a lot more. So a large male, you get about 5 times that because it scales with cell number. So if you have a lot more cells, you're gonna have a lot more potassium, you're getting a larger dose. Again, is that scary? 50 milligram? I don't know. You're gonna have to decide for yourself. Let's go up by a factor of 2, 100 milligram. 100 milligram is the maximum dose that you can get from a nuclear facility by any member of the public. 100 milligram is also the dose you get for an x-ray to the hip. So if you've had your hip x-ray, you got about 100 milligram. Is that scary? Well, it would be if you were in a nuclear facility and you found out they violated their federal limit for off-site radiation dose levels. This applies for even an ISPAC, for if I'm doing used nuclear fuel storage. You're still not going to get a change to that law. That's the maximum amount. So if a cowboy at the fence goes and parks there, or a homeless community goes up and builds a community there, the dose rate of the fence, by law, has to be less than 100 milligram. And I can assure you, a nuclear operator is going to make sure it's a lot less than that. Most detectors are calibrated within 30%. So if you're right there at 99 and a regulator comes up and they've got a different calibration than you and they read 101, you just violated the federal regulation and you probably just made headlines. So is that scary? 100 milligram. We're just going to keep going up. We're going to keep playing this game the whole way up. 310. So I mentioned that this is about natural vacuum. 310. That's about what you get on average. It's a population weighted average here in the United States. 310. That's why you get about a milligram per year. Is that scary? That's what you get in a year on average if you live in the United States, meaning that you're probably on one of the coasts. 310. Is that scary? It's less than the average. On average, we all get about 620. Right? Is that scary? Well, this number is probably going to terrify you. 500 milligram per year. That's the minimum by which the EPA can legally recommend that you maintain an exclusion zone if there was a nuclear accident. So if there was radioactivity that was anthropogenic, not the natural stuff, but if there was anthropogenic radioactivity there, like cesium or something like that, if you can get 500 milligram a year, then they can recommend you maintain an exclusion zone. So that's got to be terrifying, right? The 625 that we get on average, that's not scary, right? That's just from natural plus medical. But this 500, right? That's where you're told you can't go back to your home, right? I mean, that's got to be terrifying. You can't go home because it's an exclusion zone. That's the threshold for an exclusion. Let's just keep going up. See what your threshold is. 1,000 milligrams. So if you're old like me, you might have had a stress test. Stress test where they take radioactivity generated in the core of a nuclear reactor and stick it into your veins so that they can basically do outpatient diagnosis. So when I had my stress test, I went home with a Band-Aid on my arm. That's all it cost me. Things that many decades ago would have required surgery, cutting something, and a hospital stay. You can do it passively with a Band-Aid, outpatient. If you've ever had a CT scan of the chest, head, or hip. I did when I was 9, I fractured my skull. I got a CT scan, it cost me about 1,000 milligram, about a full round. Is that scary? CT scan to the chest, head, torso, is it 1,000 milligrams? Is that scary? That's the threshold for the EPA to recommend evacuation. So I used to serve on the nest. If a member of the public can get 1,000 milligram in a year from a release, the EPA can legally recommend to the governor that you evacuate. That's got to be terrifying, right? I mean, evacuating your home, that's like finding out that there's a forest fire down the road, right? With volcanoes erupting, right? So that's got to be terrifying, right? 1,000 milligrams. That's the threshold to initiate, to recommend evacuation. Let's keep going up. Orders of magnitude. 5,000 milligrams. That is a legal dose to a radiation worker in the United States. So there's this thing called linear no threshold. It's a theory, and if it's true, this is a safe dose. This is an OSHA-compliant dose for industrial risk that you accept by getting a paycheck. You get a paycheck, you accept risks. Maybe you're working with food and there's hot grease, or or maybe you're working with tools and they spin or they slam things or whatever, there's a certain risk that you accept with that. 5,000 millirem is considered a safe dose for a radiation worker in the United States. Are we scared yet? Let's just keep going up. Let's just keep going up. 10,000 millirem. We finally hit a place where there is at least one journal paper that points out that you can now finally get measurable medical effects. Everything we've talked about so far, and we've been looking at this for over about 100 years, everything we've looked at for so far has no known measurable medical effects. If there's anything there, it's too small to see. But there's at least one journal paper that says if you have a child and they've had acute exposures, specifically for radiotherapy, the process that we use today to cure cancer, that I can have a secondary cancer probability of about 0.5%. So we finally hit a threshold where you have measurable medical effects. And to put that in context, gender weighted, all population weighted, if you live long enough, you have about a 40% chance of getting cancer if you don't die from something else. And so that is the threshold for being able to see an increase in cancer rates. All right, let's keep going up. 100,000, now we're finally at the threshold for acute radiation syndrome. Acute radiation syndrome is different than cancer. Basically, acute radiation syndrome is where we just kill your immune system. You get such a big dose of radiation, the bone marrow is more sensitive than other places. The bone marrow is what makes the white blood cells. That's where our immune system comes from. And we kill that if you start to get doses this big. And at 100,000 millirem, that's about a 5% increase in cancer probability. So we're talking massive doses. And most of the people that we found this out from were the atomic bomb survivors. That's the level of dose that we're talking about. Going up another order of magnitude, going up factor of 500,000 millirem. Again, atomic bomb survivors. This is what we call a lethal dose of radiation, LD 50-30. 50% of the people will die within 30 days if they get this kind of dose, LD 50-30. And this is because your immune system is shot. You're like a later stage age patient at this point. You have no immune system. You need a hospital bed right away. You might feel fine, but you have no immune system. And that's pretty scary because a simple virus, a simple fungus, a simple bacteria, and you have no immune system. You need to be in a hospital so that you can recover from this. It is recoverable, but without help, and we found from the atomic bomb survivors, that is considered the lethal dose. If you go up another factor of 2, we're up at 1,000 rem. And basically, this is where a person is just put on hospice. You have little to no hope if you get an acute dose like this. So all of that said, all of these values up here are values where the regulations are. There are no regulations down here. None. The regulations are all up there. And all of those regulations are generally 2 or 3 orders of magnitude below the threshold for measurable medical effects. The regulations are 110 and 5. That's what the regulations are. That's what terrifies people. Again, it's that less than 0.1% fraction of radiation that we get. But again, I encourage you to remember, 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram. You have no clue. Most people, a millirem is equivalent because it is equivalent. If you don't know, you don't know. Right? It can be terrifying if you don't know. And so I asked this question. How much money, time, and fear does something deserve that has no measurable medical effects? In the United States, it's in billions of dollars. I'm literally being descriptive here. Billions of dollars to avoid doses, millirem, 10 millirem. That's what we spend to avoid those kinds of doses. Because it terrifies people. I mean, remember, 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram. That's gobbledygook. There's some radiation dose that is scary. And where does all this come from? If you look at potassium, you can see it mainly up here on the Colorado Plateau. Potassium, gives you a certain dose, fractions, about 10% of your natural, 5% of your natural dose, something like that. Potassium and thorium, you can see it's fairly common. But one thing that's interesting is right along here, and you look at the Mississippi Delta, you can see, the same with uranium over here, that you get a concentration because of the natural radioactivity that is in the Colorado Plateau is being weathered, and it ends up depositing down the Mississippi Valley, along with the Ohio River Valley up here. And that's just terrestrial. That's where the radon comes from, the decay of the uranium and the thorium. And then you can see up here in the top right, that's cosmic. So this is terrestrial dose. This is where the natural radiation comes from, or these sources. This is the dominant source of natural radioactivity, where you get that 310 milligram per year is from this stuff. The amount that's in your food, it's in your air, and then what's coming from cosmic. All right, so all that said, why are renewables such an integral part of the national conversation? Well, largely it just comes down to climate change. We don't like having energy sources that emit greenhouse gases when they're deployed. It's pretty much as simple as that. We don't want greenhouse gases emitted while electricity is being made. This is an interesting graph. This came from the United Nations, and what's interesting about this is that if you look at all of the options combined, nuclear has the lowest. So if that's really all you're concerned about is greenhouse gas emissions during deployment, nuclear is the lowest. If that's really all you're concerned about. If that's it, then that's it. But the others, you'll notice that they're all quite good as well. The traditional renewables are all quite good, but nuclear is lower. And because of energy density. That slide that we started with. Another issue, and Scott kind of hammered on this, is how many mines do you want? If you want to get a terawatt hour of energy, how many mines are you willing to have in your land? How many milling facilities? How many manufacturing facilities? How much waste are you willing to generate to get a terawatt hour? If you just look at critical minerals, you can see nuclear, the only thing that's going to be lower is hydro. So as long as you've got lakes that you can dam, or lakes you can make with a dam, you can make hydro. But once hydro has been used up, you can either use combined cycle natural gas, or if you want the lowest, that's non-greenhouse gas emitting, it's going to be nuclear, substantially lower. And again, it just depends on how many mines you want. How much of the land do you need to use to get that much energy? If you're like me, I love the national parks. I love that about our country, and I think a lot of other countries followed us, that we've made it a law that there are places that you can only go and look at. And the only infrastructure that's allowed is what allowed for you to go in there and look at. And how much you can touch is incredibly limited. There are places where you can go and touch pit parts, but that's it. Because I don't personally think that it's advisable to see land and say, oh, it's not being used, let's go use it. I mean, you can do that if you want, but personally, I'd like to leave as much of it as untouched as possible. And if that is something that you value, then nuclear is going to be, by far and large, the one that's going to take up the smallest footprint during deployment. This doesn't include the mines, this doesn't include milling, manufacturing. This is just for deployment. How much land is being used while you're making electricity? The lowest you're going to get by orders of magnitude, this is semi-log, so it's 100 times less than what you have for solar, energy density. Here's an interesting one. If you want to look at toxicity, how much carcinogens are you going to make? What is the public cancer potential? Is it per terawatt hour? Now, you might think solar is incredibly safe. Wind is incredibly safe. You're not going to have public carcinogenity issues with those. Well, you kind of don't. It is as safe as you think it is. But what this United Nations report showed is that nuclear is lower than those. As safe as solar and wind are in terms of carcinogenic potential, nuclear is lower. Energy density, even with all the used nuclear fuel, all the radioactivity, energy density. It's like a magic bullet. That's why we love fusion. That's why we tell these don't we love fusion. Well, what about the accidents? That's another one, right? That is like a showstopper. That's like an end-all. If I just mentioned Fukushima, that's like the end of the conversation for many people. Or I said 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl. Well, let's look at those. Let's look at those in context based on what we've already learned. 3 Mile Island The reason why I picked 1 millirem to start off that graph, I could have picked any number. The reason I picked 1 millirem, that daily natural background radiation dose, that's the average dose a member of the public got from the entire 3 Mile Island event. Partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor, and the average dose to a member of the public there was about 1 millirem. It terrified people. Does to this day. Terrifies people to this day. All right, well, what about Fukushima? That was a Western design, just like 3 Mile Island is a Western design. Didn't meet the same criteria that we would have had here, but it still was a Western design. And yet, if you look at what the United Nations stated, the World Health Organization, or all of the review papers, including my own, all of the radioactivity from 3 out of 4 nuclear reactors, full meltdown, it did not release enough radioactivity to produce any expected measurable medical effects in the Japanese public forever. Remember, you have to have 10 rem just to hit a threshold of something measurable. They all received less than a rem, less than a CT scan. The only public deaths from Fukushima were from a panicked evacuation. So a 9.0 earthquake, 14-meter wave, biblical in scale for all intents and purposes, killed approaching 20,000 people. That's not the narrative that you hear, the people that died from the tsunami. You hear about Fukushima, and the only deaths were from a panicked evacuation, so that the people literally risked and lost their lives to avoid an exposure that would have had no measurable medical effects. What about Chernobyl? Chernobyl, that was just a bad design, a bad operation, and no emergency response. It's like any one of those could have largely fixed most of the issues that came from it. But Chernobyl, it's got its own story. I'm not going to be able to. Chernobyl's got its own story. With Chernobyl, the latest research that came out from Chernobyl was looking at the Estonians. The Estonians are a unique example. With the Estonians, during Chernobyl, Estonia was part of the former Soviet Union, and the men from Estonia that were in the army responded to Chernobyl. Well, there were a lot of men from Estonia that did not. They stayed home, they weren't in the army. They were just working and doing their lives. And so after the event, it made for a perfect epidemiological cohort. You could go to those Estonian men that responded to Chernobyl and compare their disease rates to the men that did not, right? They have the same genetic makeup, they have the same lifestyle, they eat the same food, they dated the same girls, right? And you say, what's the difference between the ones that went to Chernobyl and the ones that didn't? Well, they did a study in 2016, another one in 2023, and they found that there was a small statistically significant increase in cancer rates for the Chernobyls, the people that responded to Chernobyl. No surprise. That was expected, but what wasn't expected was a 600% increase in both studies of suicide rates for the liquidators. Basically, again, 10 to the minus 5 joules per kilogram. You don't know. It's like some gobbledygook. And if you got that dose from Chernobyl, what does that do? Right? Who knows, right? Unless you're a health physicist, you're not going to know. And so they would attribute all kinds of normal health effects, arthritis, hearing loss, normal aging symptoms that would occur to anybody. But if you don't know, you don't know, right? How do you know Chernobyl didn't cause it? How do you know Chernobyl didn't make it worse? You don't. And if it's magic Chernobyl, there's a stigma that goes with that. You start attributing all of these health effects that you have to Chernobyl, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you really just have no hope. And so the biggest death rate, even from Chernobyl, was fear. That's insane. From fear. Because you just don't know. If we include Chernobyl with the accident statistics, even if you include Chernobyl, nuclear is safer than wind from accidents, because people fall off turbines, they get electrocuted. Solar beats out nuclear by about the same amount, so they're all, for all intents and purposes, equivalent. But if you recognize that Chernobyl, again, I said this before, including that with modern nuclear is like, in my opinion, it's like including the Hindenburg with modern air travel statistics. It's a completely different technology. It's not used anymore. It's even illegal.
And so if you include that in accident statistics, nuclear is still safer than wind, even with Chernobyl included, energy density. If you take it out, if you don't include Chernobyl, nuclear is orders of magnitude below everything else, energy density. So it just depends on how you look at it. So that said, I did mention before that the design specification for nuclear is that the worst thing that can possibly happen is that nobody gets hurt. Even before 9/11, by law, every nuclear power plant built in the West had to withstand a large jet impact directly onto the containment, and there could be no leak. No emission of radioactivity beyond what was already there. Before 9/11. Again, the design specification for nuclear is the worst thing that can possibly happen is that nobody gets hurt. So I don't have time to show this. I've already been given warnings on my time, but we now have, by the Department of Energy, the safest train in the world. That's what they're claiming. I'm just going to skip by it. This is what an ISPAC would look like, should you choose to do one. And now, I'm as close as I could get, Lisa, to bringing us to questions. Before I do that, I'm going to ask everybody to go to your email while we're doing questions and answer the third survey.